Your book is subtitle is A Personal History of Resistance. It's mostly about resistance to fascism. However, the book doesn't mention Ukraine very much. You've been rather dovish, I guess, in urging a compromise between Russia and Ukraine at times. Is Ukraine not, perhaps alongside those resisting genocide in Gaza, a prime example of a people resisting fascism today? And how do you see the story of what's going on in Ukraine at the moment as, how do you put the events of your book and Greece's struggle against fascism, how would you draw a parallel between those two or not?
Yes and no. There's a lot of fascism in that part of the world. There are a lot of fascists. Tragically, they are on both sides. Let me remind you that the Wagner battalion, the Wagner group, which are the Russian mercenaries, you know what they are called, Wagner, right? Because Wagner was the favorite musician of the Nazis. And the founder of the Wagner group, these awful quasi-Nazi Russian mercenaries, they took up that name in order to signify their connection to Nazism. But on the other side, you have the Azov battalion, the Ukrainian Azov battalion, who have the swastikas carved on their skin. So, it's a gross mistake to look at that terrible war, that horrible, horrible sacrifice of human life. As you know, the good versus the bad. Here you have, to a very large extent, fascist groups attacking one another, Russian and Ukrainian. You've got people who are neither fascist nor Democrats. They are just conscripts who never chose to go and fight, who would much rather go home fighting and killing each other. You have Democrats on both sides, Ukrainians and Russians, fearing for their life, fearing for the fascists that are fighting next door to them. It is a wholly unnecessary conflict. It is a conflict that is simply pulverizing human beings without any discernible effect in terms of geopolitics. This is what really maddens me. That, I hear people saying to me that we must not appease Putin because Putin is a beast. I have no doubt that Putin is a beast. Jeremy Corbyn and I were demonstrating against Putin in 2001 in London, and we were being pinpointed by the liberal press, by the liberal establishment, as being eccentrics. Because back then, let me remind you, Vladimir Putin was the blue-eyed boy of the West. The West turned a blind eye when he killed 250,000 Chechens in order to solidify his presidency, right? Like Saddam Hussein used to be the golden boy of the West when he was doing their bidding against Iran.
Yeah, I mean, one could certainly say that, the West has been hypocritical in some of their, engagements on this. However, another thread, I guess, running through this book is resistance to, forms of imperialism.
Let me make this one point, however.
Yeah,
You said that I'm dovish. No, I'm not dovish at all. I am very harsh on Putin. I'm very harsh on NATO that really puts its own expansion above peace in Europe. I'm extremely critical of people on my side of politics, of the left, who think that, well, if Putin is against the Americans, then we must be with Putin. Under no circumstances. But I see that this war can never end in anything other than more death, more land losses to Ukraine, and you have a West which asks you and me to consider Putin to be the new Hitler, but they're not prepared to send soldiers to fight him and to defeat him. And all they do is they want constantly to replenish the armory of Ukraine without any peace inside. So at this moment, to end the conflict, to end the killing, and to proclaim that the area, which is genuinely very complicated, the Donbas area, Benjamin, it's a bit like Northern Ireland. There are two communities living side by side. They look and sound very similar, but they have there are great conflicts and haters between them. We found a solution to the Northern Ireland problem. It wasn't perfect. Both sides are dissatisfied with it. But it's better than the conflict that continued for, decade after decade. I don't believe that this position is a dovish position. I think it's a rational position.
Yeah, I guess it's an interesting response. I guess in your book, you sort of center some of the narratives of people resisting imperialism, resisting fascism. However, I just reading that couldn't help but put the Ukrainians who are resisting a form of imperialism in that frame, in the same way that I would put people resisting, Israel's aggression in Gaza in that frame, for instance. Would you put it in that frame too? But I guess the language that you use around, compromise and wanting to end the war, I mean, obviously, there will need to be a compromised solution to the war, but centering and sort of making the hero of those who are resisting imperial aggression would seem to me to be contiguous with the message of your book. Would you agree or not?
I agree. The day after Putin invaded Ukraine, I posted on my blog a photo in which it said we need to stand with Ukraine, because any country that gets invaded, we need to stand with it. If we believe in international law and if we don't believe in the right of anyone to invade anybody else. But at the same time, we have to take into account the fact that in 2014, there was a coup d'etat in Ukraine. Russian was banned by the new regime in Kiev. This is why I highlighted, Benjamin, the fact that there were fascists fighting on both sides. And when you have that, you've got... What does resistance mean at that point? Well, you have to resist warmongering. Because warmongering feeds the bad actors on both sides. They love it. The fascist Ukrainians and the fascist Russians want more war. Putin wants war. Zelensky wants war, because if there is peace, he's going to fall. So we have to resist mindless killing and mindless authoritarianism on both sides.
Yeah. So moving on to sort of elsewhere in Europe, I guess Germany spearheaded calls for Greece to tighten its belt and slash spending when you were finance minister. But now Germany seems to be loosening its belt a little and allowing itself to spend more on the military and green energy, for instance. Have you greeted this development with, to use a German term, a bit of Schadenfreude, Yanis?
No, absolutely not. Because these are the developments that are feeding fascism, both in Germany and in my country. So, no, I will not even smile in the thought that history is on my side. No. See, history is not on our side. History is on the side of fascism, of authoritarianism in all countries. Look at what's happening in Germany with the rise of the Alternative for Deutschland. I'm not going to celebrate the fact that they now have their own Golden Dawn. Golden Dawn are the Greek Nazis. What happens when a society breaks down is fascism rises up. And this is terrible for everyone, for the Greeks, for the Germans, for the Brits, for all of us. So no, I don't. But what is happening look, Benjamin, hypocrisy is one of the things that these women in my book have taught me not to tolerate. And you said that the Germans wanted us to tighten our belts. That's not true. From 1999, 2000, when we entered the Eurozone, we Greeks entered the Eurozone, and the Italians and the Irish and so on, the Germans were really very happy for us to be profligate. Mercedes, Volkswagen, IG, Bosch, they would send us the product and give us the loan as well to buy it. That's called vendor lending, right? They were very happy for us to live beyond our means. And I remember I was talking to an executive of Deutsche Bank in 1999. I happened to be sitting next to him on an aeroplane going to the United States. And, he found out that I'm a Greek economist, a professor of economics. He was an executive of Deutsche Bank. And he said, you must be very happy that your country is entering the euro. You have a hard currency. I said, no, I'm not happy at all. The question is, why are you happy? Why are you happy that we're getting in? He said, because Greece is our wet dream. I said, what do you mean Greece is your wet dream? He said, well, we had bankers. We're German bankers who have a lot of money. The Germans don't want to borrow it from us. Your guys want to borrow it. I said, yes, but if you keep sending loans to the Greek population, who have none, back then Greece had no debt, especially the private sector. Nobody had credit cards, mortgages, nothing. If you keep pumping that money into the country in the form of debt, yes, there will be a semblance of growth. At some point, there will be bubbles. Then they burst. Then they will not be able to pay the loans back. And they said, yeah, well, in that case, we'll take your houses, which is what's happening as we speak, right? But the tragedy is that Germany suffers from that, because when demand for its goods, for its exports, collapses, then Volkswagen cannot sell cars. So what do, Benjamin? As we speak, they are handing over whole production lines to Rheinmetall to produce tanks. Now, who's going to buy tanks? Not the consumers. The governments have. And the governments have to convince the public that, the public must stop funding pensions, the NHS, universities, Social Security, and they should buy tanks that, by the way, nobody needs, especially the Ukrainians, because these tanks are like death traps. So this is where we are now. Now, there's nothing to celebrate there, because even though they are buying now tanks, we are buying tanks. Greece is now buying tanks we don't need, right? Maybe we need drones, but we certainly don't need the Rheinmetall tanks. But this is what they produce and they give us. And we get more loans in order to buy those useless tanks. And, the result is that the social fabric is fragmenting even more. And fascism rises up both in Greece and in Germany. There is nothing to celebrate here.
Yeah, I mean, I guess surely there is something to celebrate, though, in Germany and other European powers sort of slowly moving away from an austerity mindset, though, for instance. And I guess,
Sure.
whilst
That
military spending might not be where you'd like to see it spent, in history, for instance, you see examples of, the US, the UK, for instance, having to spend more on a war effort, but then that creates a precedent for expanding the social state, post World War II, for instance. Is there no cause for optimism here, Yanis, that they
absolutely
might have
none.
turned a page? No.
Absolutely none. You know why, Benjamin? Because you're absolutely right. War gives a major impetus to growth. And in the post-war period, you have reconstruction and so on. But now we don't have a war. I mean, there is a war in Ukraine, but there's no war in Germany. There's no war in Italy. Now, military Keynesianism can work. In the United States, it works. After the Second World War, it has worked. Why has it worked? In Britain, by the way, it hasn't. But in the United States, it's worked. Why? Because the United States have a war every year. They started with the Korean War, then they had the Vietnam War, then they invaded Iraq, then Afghanistan, then they have the war in Ukraine. They had the war during the first Gulf War in Iraq. After the surrender of the Iraqi army, the American Air Force unloaded all their, just fired all their weapons into the desert in order to order new ones. So you need to have, it's not enough for Rheinmetall to build 10,000, let's say they built 10,000 tanks. Okay, then what will they do? We're going to be replete with tanks. Okay, what are we going to do? Turn them into buses. They will then this Keynesian spurt ends, and then everything collapses. Unless we decide that Europe needs to emulate the United States and have a war every year. But we started the European Union supposedly as a peace project, and now we're going to turn it into a war project. And if Putin doesn't oblige us, we'll have to find another enemy, and this is preposterous. And in any case, we just don't have the structure to do it. I mean, the United Kingdom has absolutely no capacity to finance without a war. If there was a war, yes. If there was destruction, if the French Air Force destroyed half of London, then you would have reconstruction, right? But thankfully, that's not going to happen.
Let's hope not.
All that you have is Keir Starmer, in his infinite idiocy, diverting a small amount of money from international aid to buy a few more weapons. And that's not going to help the British economy at all. It's not going to move the needle at all. So, no, it's all happening. And you said that the austerity has gone away. No. Military Keynesianism, when there's no war, means more austerity. Because what's happening now is all these weapons that the Germans will be purchasing, and most of them will be American, okay? So effectively, this money is being exported to Trump, also to pacify him. Is going to be given at the expense of social spending. So when it comes to the communities in East Germany, in South Germany, North Germany, they will feel more austerity, not less.
So, Ellen, what did you think of the interview with Yanis?
I have to say, it's kind of like, it's given me a lot to think about. It's a really interesting interview. I quite enjoyed the discussion about whether a man can write a feminist history. I think it's always an interesting debate. So I found that interesting. But the biggest thing for me was the section in which you talked a bit about resistance by Ukrainians against Russian aggression. And Yanis Varoufakis puts forward a view that I think many people will find very difficult. It's the way he kind of said it's fascists fighting fascists. In one word, condemns Putin, who he says, yes, I'm sure he's a beast, but I also condemn NATO and NATO's policy of expansionism, which feels like putting blame on NATO and on Eastern Europeans for Russian aggression, and feels very much out of the kind of, the kind of thing you hear out of the Kremlin's propaganda playbook. And I think that's, it's always interesting when you hear that kind of view from people on the left, but I think there's a lot in there that he said that the Kremlin would be quite happy with, as kind of an analysis of why the war started, and was the kind of thing that the Kremlin was putting out around the time of the full-scale invasion. So I think that's, I come away from that feeling that's really difficult, and it's not how many people would see it.
Yeah, totally. I mean, it was the most difficult part of the interview because I was trying to push back on him a bit. I guess the actual nuts and bolts policy implications of what he's saying, I guess that they need to sit down at the negotiating table. That's sort of uncontroversial at this point. I think most parties are, seeing that's going to be a negotiated end to the conflict.
I mean, Zelensky's the one who's saying, yes, we'll negotiate. Putin isn't.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, there's that. And then there's also the question of just the rhetoric and the way that you describe the conflict. That has a bearing on, how those negotiations are framed, right? And I think the ways in which Yanis framed the conflict, talking about fascists on both sides, for instance, I mean, technically true. There are some fascists in Ukraine, but it's also, as you say, a Russian talking point to play up the existence of fascism in Russia as a kind of, they're there, and therefore we have to, impose.
I mean,
aggression. It's a troubling talking point, I think. Yeah.
Putin says they are denazifying Ukraine.
Yeah.
Of course, there are some people in Ukraine who have far right views. And there is the Azov battalion that, of course, was much scrutinized, but that's one far-right unit when most Ukrainians who are fighting, are not far-right and are not Nazis. And I think it's the thrust of his argument was that it's kind of, equal on both sides, which, doesn't seem helpful to the purposes of peace long term in Ukraine or for most Ukrainians.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about these kind of talking points that you sometimes see brought up on the left at the moment, because you are hearing them again. For instance, on Politics Joe the other day, they had Zara Sultana of your party here in the UK, and she was talking about the Ukraine war, and she said that whilst Putin is a dictator and a gangster, Zelensky is also no friend of the working class. So there is that sort of rhetoric that is coming up again on parts of the left around this conflict. It's not a framing that I agree with personally, and I guess to put it in the context of Yanis's book, he's got a lot of descriptions of Greeks resisting fascism in World War II, and then resisting the military dictatorship after that. And I found it just a sort of a gaping hole in the book. There was an analogy between what he's describing there and other events in Ukraine where Ukrainians are resisting forms of imperialism. Some could say fascistic tendencies of the Putin regime, right? There was an obvious sort of begging analogy to be made there, but he doesn't in the book. And when I tried to push him on that, he agreed that there is some analogy to be made there, but his rhetoric is quite muddled, quite both sidesy, and in my view, it's problematic rhetoric, as you say. reflecting some of Russia's talking points on this.
This interview was from an episode of the Prospect podcast. To read more of Prospect's award-winning journalism, head to prospectmagazine.co.uk.